Welcome to Vertiva's Let's Talk Roadmap Rundown, the show where we talk through the latest updates, enhancements, and features coming soon to Microsoft 365. It's Tuesday, May 7th. I'm Scott Ludwan, and today I'm joined by Chris Strong, our Senior Microsoft Practice Director, to talk through the latest news and announcements from the Roadmap and Message Center.
Good to be with you, Scott.
Welcome, Chris. On this week's edition of the Roadmap Rundown, we're going to be talking about a few different topics, starting with organizational messages that are coming to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, the future of the Stream mobile app, 4 new features coming to Microsoft Teams, including a faster way to make your digital avatars, Microsoft's SharePoint's new tenant rename feature for those with advanced management, and an update to Clipchamp to help speed up your podcasts. Before we get into the news for the week, we'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment of your time to like, subscribe, and share the channel with your friends and colleagues. Over 50% of our watchers and listeners aren't subscribed to the channel, and hitting those buttons is a huge help to us because it helps us get our show out in front of more people and helps grow the channel. So, Chris, excited to have you back on the show. You haven't been on the podcast, I feel like, in
Been a while.
quite some time at this point. I think you were on the show last year in July.
All right.
Yeah, because I was out there in July. I remember doing a show with you either at the beginning of the month or mid-month. And then we had some client visits and we had kind of our mid-year kind of management review out in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And then I traveled back and then we kind of pivoted the Let's Talk podcast format, which is more of kind of the demo-oriented, more training, more knowledgeable, like longer segment type show. We had Holly come on and start doing that. We had Todd on recently. And then Holly and I had the idea of, you know what, we should really do more of a message center oriented show. And I think that the thought between me and Holly on that was that there's so many things popping through Message Center all the time, and there's not always enough awareness around them that, hey, why don't we just take 30 minutes every week and do a show like this? And that's kind of where we pivoted to the Roadmap Rundown. So I'm excited to have you on the show, and we've got I think 8 messages today to go through.
I believe so, yeah. Yeah, and it's just a quick comment too that for some it's stating the obvious already, but how critical that Message Center and just staying on top of what's in Message Center can be. One of the better ways to just keep up with all the changes throughout Microsoft 365 that until something better comes along, it's one of the more reliable ways to do so. So just a vote of encouragement for everyone out there to continue looking at Message Center, if not daily, at least weekly.
And the roadmap too. And the reason why we really call this the Roadmap Rundown, and Holly and I talked about it on the show last week, is a lot of times stuff might show up on the roadmap sooner than it shows up in Message Center. Yeah. And a lot of times in Message Center, when you go to dive back and find that Message Center ID, it doesn't seem to always exist anymore. But we found it more reliable sometimes to go back and check those roadmap IDs. I don't know if they just have the database is slightly larger on one side or the other, but yeah, so we'll call those out as we go through each of the messages. So let's kick stuff off here. And we're going to start with the Microsoft 365 Admin Center organizational messages, which is now in preview for the Admin Center. Message Center ID 789803 and roadmap ID 392847. So I'll set this one up and then we can kind of talk through it. So the Microsoft 365 Admin Center will soon introduce a preview of organizational messages. So if you've been using Microsoft Intune, you may have already seen this feature come up. This is expanding even further on that feature where you're no longer limited to just devices, but now you can just kind of push messages directly through the Admin Center through any of the Microsoft apps that are connected within your tenant. So this feature is in early preview. One of the things that they call out here is that the rollout is going to begin in preview in May, so this month. And there's more details under that roadmap ID, and we'll show some screenshots here in a moment. But the big kind of key things to prepare for here are making sure that you understand how you can access the policies, how you assign people to be able to actually author policies and approve policies so that they can go out as messages to your users. And also making sure that you understand any potential costs that may come with this down the line, because they do call that out, is that in preview, there's no licensing cost to this, but they may decide to pivot on that slightly at some point in the future as it gets closer to going live. So
I'd go as far as saying you can probably count on the fact that they're going to do that.
Yeah. I mean, it does cost extra with the Intune suite, so I wouldn't be surprised at all to see that it may, at the very least, probably sit at an E3 license or an E5 license, or have like an additional standalone bump up cost to it.
Yeah.
So, Chris, what are your thoughts on the feature? I mean, I think that it's a win-win for everybody, until they decide that it's going to cost a couple extra bucks a month. But I mean, it's something that I think has been long asked for by organizations.
Yeah, definitely a highly desired capability that it's funny how some of these things work where if you go back far enough, 20 plus years ago, there was some of this kind of functionality in things like the .NET Core, operating systems at the time and in the old school days of like Windows 2000 and that sort of thing for administrators to be able to send through Active Directory messages. And it's sort of been resurrected, thankfully, to be able to do more of that again. I think obviously the bigger difference this time is being able to proffer it through the application themselves, not just the operating system solely. Meet those users where they are, more likely to be spending time and able to view those messages. What's been interesting too with this particular development of Microsoft bringing this capability into M365 apps and Windows 11 itself is, you mentioned a few minutes ago, the Intune corollary, where there's been organizational messages in Intune for, I don't know, a year or two now. It was a lot more limited, it seemed like, in how much you could customize those messages and where they could show up and how they could show up. This looks to be a lot more flexible and a
Yep.
lot more malleable to be able to create a lot of custom messages and set different policies about who they can go to, when they're going to go, where they're going to show up, all that stuff. So this, to me, strikes me as much more practical for everyday utilization in most organizations, and probably is going to have a lot more benefit to just being able to operationalize it on a common basis. Although, just like anything, there's the potential for abuse, where if you just hit people with messages 7, 8 times a day,
Yeah, they
you're
just
gonna
ignore them.
people just, yeah, they're not going to pay attention to them. So I think
I
it's going to force everyone to have to be somewhat judicious with how they mete out the administrative permissions to even create and distribute these, but then also put some gateways or approval. I believe it has an approval process built into it as
It
well,
does.
but
Yep.
have the ability to sort of filter those and make sure that only the right ones go out at the right time.
I think the most interesting piece for me is how they layered this into the admin center right now. Is it's
Hmm.
layered in under reports, which I feel like this should probably have its own separate tab, or maybe it should be under resources. It's kind of a weird spot to put it, but if you look at the screenshot, and I'll blow this up for the screen too, so you can see it a little bit better, but it looks like, at least in the example screenshot that they have, they show you being able to deliver it through Windows Spotlight, being able to deliver it to the Windows taskbar, or even the Windows notification area. So in Intune right now, I believe, and I could be wrong about this, is the main way that it's delivered is through the Windows taskbars. You get like a little box that shows up on the Windows taskbar next to all of your pinned icons, and then you click on that and it shows you. So the big change here, and honestly, this is what should help catch users' attention a little bit more. And I'm going to open this up and we'll see how well it looks here. And again, I'll blow this up so it looks a little bit better on the screen is, but if you come over kind of to the side, and I'll zoom in here quite a bit, is you can kind of see that it's popping up from the bottom of the taskbar there. So it just basically pops up like any normal Toast notification would. So hopefully that grabs users' attention. And I don't know if there'll be a way that you can configure how long it sits there, or does the user actually have to interact with it for it to go away? But I think that this will be a big improvement for users within the organization, especially when you're trying to deliver important news that commonly you would do through email or through a
Right.
Yammer site or through your internet. And that, people just, a lot of times, I've worked for a number of different organizations that believe that, oh, if we put it on the front page of the internet and we force the first page you open when you open Microsoft Edge or Internet Explorer, whatever you were using at the time, to be the internet, everybody will read that. But what everyone does is they open the browser and they just go immediately to what they're looking at, because that home page that you forced on them just became noise.
Right.
So I think that a new way to deliver these messages like that will be helpful. I know one of the ones that we've done in the past and will probably be helpful for organizations here as well is if we're doing forced like security vulnerability updates, is that will pop up at the bottom and say, make sure that you leave your computer on your desk and turned on overnight. You're getting the newest update to Windows 11 over the weekend or something like that. Is that if you keep prompting them with that'll help out.
There's another circumstance that I think probably if used appropriately, could have a pretty significant impact, which is outages and communicating
Yeah.
things that often just in service desk context, we see bombard service desk. Oh, email goes down, or some other application isn't working. Well, we've worked with enough companies that are like, man, if we really could have a way to just get to these users ahead of it so that they're not bombarding our service desk and now our queue is filling up and our SLAs are all out of
Yep.
whack all of a sudden. Here, we can empower the service desk operations to be able to proactively communicate. Yes, we know there's an outage. We're working on it, so don't bother calling in. That kind of stuff. I think could have an equal weighting of value to a lot of companies, even if they don't use it as much for proactive notifications.
Yeah, and if
In
your
front of those.
service desk manager is an author and can come
Right.
in here and publish these and I put some templates on the screen while you're talking about that too, because this is super helpful, is they're actually helping you build the messages through these kind of different types of templates rather than you having to go in there and key it in each and every time. But yeah, I agree is that this is a way that your user doesn't even necessarily need to call the service desk to hear that IVR message that's telling you on the front end that, oh yeah, we know that there's a problem and we're working on it. It'll just going to pop up right on their computer. The question is, and we haven't done any practicing on this in theory in our own org yet, because, it's early. This is just going into preview now, is when you click the button, how soon does the message actually go out? Does it
Yeah.
go into a queue? Does it hit a batch of 50 computers at a time? Does it go out one by one? That's something in theory that I think is going to need to be tested before we can at least sign off on it and say that it's good for an org.
Not only that, but maybe this could be the logic of putting it in the reports section, other than just maybe they felt like, hey, we don't have enough stuff in there. We got all these other sections with all these features, and this reports one only has a couple items in it normally. But is once we get our hands on it, figuring out how much of that, to your point, uh, input back, that logability of, is there any way to confirm that users observed this? Like, were they logged into their machine when it popped up, and having
So I'm
some
glad you
granular
asked that
reporting?
question, because in the reports area, there actually does appear to be a total messages sent,
Oh
total
yeah, good
click, and
call.
click-through rate. So that will be helpful to actually see who's paying attention. So like when you send, for example, on the third line there, when you send 1,000 of these and you only get an 11% click-through rate, well,
Yeah.
does that mean that because you sent it through the taskbar, people didn't see it, as opposed to maybe the notification center having that 22% click rate? Or is it just, users just ignore it and let it go away on its own? Also, will clicking it be able to take you to a page to provide you even more notification information about what's happening?
Sure.
Or is it just that short little, like that legacy Twitter message where you could only send, what was it, like 100 or 200
Yeah.
characters or something like that?
I have
So,
to think, yeah, they'll have some pretty strict thresholds on character amounts and stuff, because otherwise this thing could end up with the whole screen, and then something
yep.
tells me that they're just not going to allow for things like that. And then I did want to highlight too, this is not that surprising, but I think a trend we'll continue to see grow and grow is limitations like, hey, Windows 11 and newer, right? So the Windows 10, M365 apps only, not Office 2016. Just that reliance or that requirement that you're going to be, or that they're going to require people to be on the newer versions of the operating system, and in this case, the productivity suite, is a trend that's just going to. I mean, this is just indicative of where that's all
Yep.
continuing to go.
Yeah, good call out, especially with, Windows 10 getting closer and closer and closer to its end of life here.
Yep.
Um, One other thing I wanted to call out before we jump to the next one, though, is so they do provide you with a little bit more information about taking next steps and what you need to do to prepare, and what you need to do to prepare, essentially, outside of enabling certain policies in your organization for it to work, is you need to assign people to the author approval. And it looks like you don't have to assign the recipient role, which, thank goodness, right? But that would generally just be all users. But they make the recommendation that authors and approvers could be global administrators. And yeah, sure, that's going to work. But don't assign someone in your organization that's going to send these messages or approve them the GA role. That use the organizational messages writer and approver roles
Yeah.
instead. In testing, if you're doing this in a demo tenant, sure, you can use a GA to see how it works. But in your live environment, you want as little GA permissions out there as possible, generally 7 or less,
Right.
especially as you're trying to adhere to zero trust. Chris, anything else?
No, just exciting to see this come to fruition, and excited to play with it.
All right, let's move on to the next one. So this is going to be a short one. The Stream mobile app, MC789607, is going to be retired on July 1st, 2024. So that's very quickly approaching. Users should switch to using either their OneDrive or their Microsoft 365 mobile apps. Videos with the block download policy can only be played online after that date. So I don't know how many people, Chris, have you ever actually used the Stream mobile app?
Occasionally, it's admittedly been a while, which is why I like what they're doing here. It gets to be too excessive to have users have to go, oh, this app for this app for that. This just consolidate as much as possible into the places that they're already spending time. In this case, OneDrive and SharePoint, all for the better.
Yeah. Especially with the changes to it was Stream and then it was Stream on SharePoint. As soon as it started moving over to Stream on SharePoint, like I noticed that the app just didn't work the way that I expected it to anymore. And I got rid of it at that point, especially once I started to notice in the Microsoft 365 app on your phone is that, the videos just showed up in your feed. A lot of times too, is if you're using the Outlook app on your phone as well, you can go over to the feed section and
Right.
it'll show you like your shared documents, your PowerPoints, your video recordings from meetings, and that would just link you right to where you needed to go. So I think that for the most part, it's good that this is a message that exists, but I don't think that it is going to affect too many people unless for whatever reason your organization was really heavily utilizing the old version of Stream. Reminder as well that the old version of Stream, the non-SharePoint version, is retiring early next year. So we are already pretty far down the timeline on that. So hopefully you have started working on migrating to the new environment and preparing for that. But if not, make sure that you have your eyeballs on that, because as we get further and further into the spring, summer, and fall here, is more and more of that functionality in Classic Stream is going to be turned off.
Yeah, one other comment I want to make on this that I think, at least in my opinion, is a sign of where we're going to see more of this consolidation is in the catalyst of Copilot and what they're trying to do to bring AI into all of the different service elements amongst Microsoft 365, obviously, among other things. Personally, I think there's a correlation here to say that they could have spent time to build Copilot into the Stream app in the mobile context. But why bother when it's already, to your point, Scott, something that lives in SharePoint now anyway, where
Yep.
there already is APIs and Copilot itself is already being built into that platform. It's just, yeah, consolidate. Make it all one more kind of cohesive whole instead of having 30 apps that you now have to worry about how Copilot's going to manifest into each individual one when you can just use the backend.
Totally agree. And on this week's show, we are actually not really talking about anything Copilot, but we've still managed to say Copilot at least 4 or 5 times.
Obligatory at this point.
All right. So the next 4 here, we have our Microsoft Teams related. We're going to kind of pop through these fairly quickly because for the most part, like these are good improvements and changes coming, but they're nothing super high ranging, not as big as kind of that organizational messages piece that's in preview now. So MC789611 Microsoft's Teams message reactions are being added into the right click menu. I wasn't entirely surprised to see this because they've been seeming like they're minimizing that UI more and more as time goes on in Teams. We were actually just talking about like we couldn't find like the GIFs button or something like that in one of our Teams meeting because they hid it under the plus menu.
Yeah.
But really, this is starting to roll out to public preview at the end of late April. So that's past at this point. General availability should be out there by mid-May. I don't actually have it yet, so I don't think that it's hit. I don't think that it's hit me, at least in the targeted release pool yet. But just to kind of give the audience a preview of what that looks like if you're watching on YouTube. Today, when you go to hover over a message, you get kind of like that plus and then a few different reaction emojis that you can tie onto it. But you have to kind of hover your hand there. And if you move your mouse a little bit to the left or right or top as it goes away, you might miss that click. So instead, what they're doing is they're moving that away. When you right click a message now, is it will show up above the reply, forward, copy, link buttons. So it's still there. It's just instead of a hover and a float, it's now a right click and a click. So it's kind of adding an extra click to it. What are your thoughts on it, Chris? Is it better? Is it worse for us?
I think it's for the best, only for the reason that it consolidates, and just like we were saying with the last one, it makes it more consistent in how you access additional features, let's call it, in this case with a Teams message, instead of like, oh, for this emoji thing, there's an entirely different process where you hover and you got to make sure you hover over the right spot. Now it's just more consistent for the user experience purposes. Is like, look, right click is all the extra stuff that you might need to do. So I'm in favor of just that simplicity that comes with that.
Yeah, I think it'll be an improvement overall. I think it'll take some getting used to, but again, you'll start to see that change happen. And again, the reason why we do this show is because if we didn't talk about it, you would just think that it went away until you one day you right clicked a message and it showed up.
Right.
So moving on to the next Teams item. So this is gonna create some chaos, I think. So right now, I think Microsoft is looking probably at their telemetry and realizing not that many people are going out of their way to create avatars and Teams, and there's probably a number of different reasons for that. But under Message Center 7893.15, Microsoft Teams is going to be introducing a feature to create avatars using one of your own photos using AI technology, and that's going to start rolling out in mid-May to mid-June 2024. There are some requirements on it. Your machine's going to need to have at least a quad-core processor, 4 gigabytes of RAM, and I believe that you also need the new version of Teams for this as well. Yeah. Though at this point, you should be moving to the new version of Teams unless you have a very good reason to stick with it with the retirement coming up. From a licensing standpoint, it requires Teams Enterprise or Essentials or Business Basic Standard Premium or
anything.
Yeah, pretty much anything at this point. I can kind of show the image up here on the screen as well, and I'll preview that and blow it up a little bit. But really, when you go to create an avatar right now, it just gives you the option to create from a base avatar and then customize. This is going to give you the ability to create it from a photo. There's not a whole lot more included here in terms of screenshots. I may try and test this and see if it works. One of my concerns around it is probably how janky are these avatars going to look when you upload a photo of yourself? Are you comfortable uploading a photo of yourself into Teams to allow AI to create an avatar photo? And I think my last question for it is, what if I don't upload a photo of me, but I upload a photo of somebody else? Or what if I upload like a photo of like a cartoon or an anime or something like that? Like, how is it going to react with this? I think that like this could be a whole Let's Talk demo. And maybe that'll be something that Holly and I cover maybe later in the month if this is available, because I think that this is super neat. And we actually did a show on creating avatars back in December, and that got us some decent like follows and likes on the channel as well. But yeah, I mean, it's a neat change. It's a bit of nothing burger again. Like if you're not really using this feature today, you're not going into a meeting with an avatar on, I don't think that this is really going to encourage you to go in and do it. Also, if you're using a virtualized machine, chances are you probably aren't going to be able to actually have the minimum hardware requirements to run it, which these are the same hardware requirements, I believe, that are impacting Teams today as well. So until this gets a little bit lighter in weight, it might not be a huge thing, but just something to prepare for.
Yeah, I would just throw into that my suspicion is that the primary reason they're doing this, it has more to do with just the low uptake on people creating and using avatars. And so maybe their thought here is, let's just make it as easy as possible so that, they don't have to sit and tweak. And, for anyone, it's all different, right? It depends how crazy you want to get with trying to make it look like yourself. But,
Yep.
it's 20, 30 minutes maybe of clinking around the different options to try and make your avatar look like you. Here's a shortcut. And then maybe they're thinking is if we just make
Depending on
it
how
easy
well
as
it works.
possible, yeah, that's the trade-off though, is they were already kind of difficult to make look like yourself before. I don't see this dramatically changing that. It just makes it easier.
Anecdotal story not related to Teams is Meta recently introduced the new create an avatar thing in Messenger. And when it went to create me, it looked at a picture of me, I think, because I think that they're using AI for this. And I was wearing a black shirt, and instead it made me a black man. And I was like,
oh, interesting.
But again, this is why like the generative AI stuff and like the Bings and the Bards and the Geminis and all that stuff, they're having a lot of problems processing images because of the information that it's been fed by us. And they're still trying to work on tuning that down. So hopefully we don't see any sort of disaster like this with this new create an avatar from a photo thing, but time will tell, right?
Right. Fun to play with, I guess.
Yep. Next one up is MC772558 and roadmap ID 116251. Microsoft Teams meeting recordings will now be saved to the organizer's OneDrive by default. This is going to begin rolling out in early June to late August 2024. So there's quite a bit of going on with this. Admins can use a PowerShell policy for special cases to either prevent it or stop it altogether if that's how you want it to go, how it's going today. But overall, Chris, you and I talked on the pre-show about this. Is I thought that this already happened, but then I remember that the change that they made was if you created the Teams meeting from Teams or Outlook as a personal send, is it went to someone's OneDrive. And if you created it in a channel, it went to the team SharePoint site.
Right.
What this change does is no matter who joins the meeting at what time, because this is generally what happens is the organizer doesn't always join on time, and then the recording ends up on somebody else's OneDrive. Right. This makes it so it always goes to the organizer's OneDrive, so you're no longer trying to hunt this down.
Yeah, one could argue this should have been this way the entire time, and it's probably a small tweak that they're making ultimately behind the scenes to make this function this way, but is profoundly important to just right that wrong, so to speak, of what the sanctity of that file, that recording file is.
Yep.
It's just logical that in most cases, it's that original meeting organizer that's going to want that. So it's fixing what should have been that way already. And, important as a result. I think a lot of people still didn't realize that it was defaulting anything else other than the organizer. And so that just rights that ship and makes it more logical going forward.
Yeah, I think that overall this is a good change, and the sooner they can do it, the better. We continue on the Teams train. So Message Center ID MC709270, World Map ID 191.528. Microsoft Teams users on Windows, the new Microsoft Teams on Windows, now has a mute feature available directly through the Windows taskbar. So many of you probably have been able to hit or wondered what that microphone button actually does down there. It's not just an indication of is your mic actually open. For some time in Windows 11 now, and I believe that this worked with the old Teams for a bit, which is why I was kind of puzzled when I saw that this was on Message Center, is you are able to click that button and mute, but I believe that an update broke it at some point. So you can mute yourself directly in Teams, and this icon will change, or now you can just click that button directly down there on the taskbar, and that'll mute you. Good change, Chris?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's nice to have that, especially when you're on a meeting sometimes and you're, for better or for worse, multitasking. You don't always have Teams up front. Now you have that universal place that you can go to unmute or mute yourself and that sort of thing. So just It's nice to have that consistency and continuity. That it's, again, one of those simple things that once everyone understands it and what it does, will probably get used frequently, I would assume.
Yep. We don't talk about too many Windows specific things on this show, or even really the Let's Talk podcast. But I think a lot of that has to do with just like, we're kind of in the middle of an operating system right now. It's been rolled out or been forcibly rolled out, if you want to look at it in that way. Though I did see some interesting stats over the weekend that the adoption for Windows 11 is something like only 20 to 25% of the overall Windows operating user base, where the other 75+% of it is still all Windows 10. Now, I'm sure a lot of that is the personal computer market and not necessarily the enterprise market, but it's still surprising to see that a year and a half away, less than a year and a half away from the retirement of Windows 10, is there still that many people just clinging on for dear life?
My personal opinion is I think it's going to be the opposite. I think it's going to be more the enterprise side that's going to be struggling to move.
Yeah.
As we all know, enterprise doesn't want to move fast necessarily or change things arbitrarily for all the normal reasons around disruption and consistency and all that sort of thing. So yeah,
I wonder how much of that too, Chris, is related to the specific hardware requirements by Windows 11. So you need to have you need to have a processor up to a certain snuff. You need to have a TPM chip. There may be a lot of orgs out there that are working, smaller orgs that have more outdated machines that just don't meet the requirements yet. And I mean, does Microsoft, as we get closer to that date, have to then start loosening that up a little bit, or is with whenever Windows 12 shows up next year or the year after that, will the MPU requirements just push this even further? And is this all just Microsoft's way of driving new hardware purchases?
Well, there's different ways you could look at it, but I see little things like this where they, this microphone accessibility feature within Teams, or that correlates with Teams, as Microsoft attempting to make enough feature quality of life elements associated with Windows 11 to make that willingness to transition for organizations and individuals a little bit more practical or a little bit more enticing to say like, hey, there are real differences now between your experience on 10 and 11 beyond just superficial UI things, and there's actual functional differentials that are significant. So it maybe hopefully incentivizes people to go, yeah, there's enough here now where we should make that time and effort to put this in place.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So I believe we've got 2 left here.
I think so.
Yeah. So Message Center ID 789608, roadmap 18383 details out the availability of the advanced tenant rename feature in SharePoint Advanced Management, allowing organizations to change their SharePoint domain names. It's applicable now for organizations with up to 100,000 sites and offers prioritization for 4,000 sites. The rollout began late last month in April, with the completion expected to be done probably by the end of middle of this month. Chris, you put this one kind of on our loop component. I'll let you talk mostly through it.
Yeah, so the big new feature or not feature, but aspect to this would be the idea that now it's accessible to be able to do this through SharePoint Advanced Management. It's not as if the entirety of the ability to change the domain name associated with SharePoint and OneDrive has not existed. It's been, I want to say 1 or 2 years now that that's been a thing. It's just that it required some scripting and some behind the scenes work to do, and there were limited ways to execute it in some respects. And so this just makes it that much more accessible through that advanced management layer, and should make it that much more, hopefully, seamless for people to execute on that. And as we tend to see, there's been a lot of mergers, acquisitions, and even divestitures where that exact function has been beneficial and desired and really necessary in some respects. And so now to make it that much more accessible through the advanced management portal functionality should just make it more practical for people to take advantage of, and not have to worry about understanding all the unique custom behind the scenes work that necessarily would have to go into it otherwise.
Yeah, an important thing to keep in mind too on this as well is that SharePoint Advanced Management does come at an additional license cost. It is not something that you necessarily need to buy and keep forever, but I believe, Chris, we were researching this not that long ago, is you do have to license everyone in the org for it. Is that true?
That's my understanding as well, yes. And another way to put it on this is from an advanced management value perspective and justification for that additional cost. I think this is just one of several kind of feature updates that they'll make to it to just make it more practical to justify that cost. Say, oh, well, now that we can do this, it's more reasonable for us to pay for that.
And if your organization is in the process of rolling out Copilot as well, ding, this can be very helpful for that, because it will help you get a better understanding of what exists out there in your SharePoint and OneDrive environments, what's being used, what's not being used, retiring old sites, archiving data. There's also the M365 backup and archive features out there that, again, also come at an additional cost, but kind of tie into this Microsoft Syntex or SharePoint Advanced Management functionality that you may also want to look at as well while you're rolling out Copilot, to get a better idea of, again, what exists and what don't we need to further kind of limit any sort of external data exposure that we don't need to expose.
Yeah, and it's worth noting too that as the message relates kind of in the latter part of that opening paragraph section there, the ability now that they're bringing to it to kind of enhance that ability beyond the traditional scripting route where it was just, okay, we're changing it, and then it would just go through and do it. You didn't really have a whole lot of control over which sites were handled when. That ability to set that prioritization function across, in this case, it says up to 4,000 sites for early execution, that could be useful, especially in larger organizations where maybe you want to prioritize your SharePoint home site and some of the primary site collections that are most heavily trafficked or used, are the ones that are going to be most obvious to people that as they use it day to day, that change has occurred. So it's a handy sort of extra capability that they bring to it if you do it through advanced management. That I can see
your SharePoint administrators will love this new tool. Your finance department, maybe not so much.
Right.
And final message up here. Microsoft Clipchamp removes pauses and silences in your videos. So Message Center ID 759462, roadmap ID 383 137 Clipchamp has a new AI feature for silence removal where it will automatically delete pauses over 3 seconds in videos. And it's free in preview right now, but I believe that this is going to be tagged under the premium options for Clipchamp once it fully rolls out. Rollout begins early May 2024 and is planned to complete by late July. In any case, so for me, who has edited a lot of these podcasts and has actually edited some of them in Clipchamp as early as or as late as end of last year, I was doing some work in there. I think that this is a pretty good feature to roll out. So it eliminates silences and pauses. So they're very specific about that are longer than 3 seconds.
Yeah.
So for me, that would be, hey, let's take a pause here real quick, or I'm going to use the bathroom, or I need to find an article. It'll just clip that stuff up and it'll make it easier to cut your videos together. One of the things I used last year when editing videos, because Clipchamp didn't have this yet, is I would use Audacity and I would manually clip it out, or I would use a tool like Descript that would automatically go through and remove pauses. But those pauses could be 1 second. Those pauses could be up to 5. And I feel like the big bang for your buck when you're using AI to remove silence or pauses is the addition of filler words. So the ums and the as and buts. That's not doing this quite yet, but it gives me some hopefulness that we will actually see that come sooner than later, since they're starting to roll out at least the silent section to it. If you're already using Clipchamp today, I think that this is a great addition. If you're not using Clipchamp and you were considering using Clipchamp as your editor over something like an Adobe or a Final Cut or even like a CapCut or a Camtasia, I don't think that this is going to push me in the direction of buying it or upgrading to that premium license net new, because there's just not enough value there. But at the end of the day, I think that if you're already using it, this is great. And I would look at this with hopefulness that maybe there's going to be more AI stuff that comes to Clipchamp in the nearer future here.
Yeah, certainly. Although I want to correct one thing, that's part of what this update and why I thought it was relevant to include is they did make the decision to not require premium subscriptions for this functionality. So that was nice to see that they're allowing this
Oh,
silence
interesting.
item to be just essentially a native part of the product at any level. And I think that makes sense. And I don't know that they'll all necessarily maintain that mindset for it with every feature update they bring. I'm sure they'll firewall some of the AI functionality behind premium, but for at least this in a practical sense, to me, the biggest value that it brings is not necessarily for someone that edits videos all the time. I think advanced editors like yourself, Scott, don't necessarily, I mean, yeah, it has some handy aspect to it, but I think it's making it more accessible and approachable for someone that doesn't spend a lot of time in a video editing tool to just have some automation around that so that they don't have to go and manually understand how to clip or do that ad infinitum, 60, 70 times, depending how long the video is. It's one of those things. Hey, you know what? If you're going to just chop up this video real quick, here's an easy way I can do it and automate some of that process so that person doesn't have to struggle through that.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree and I'm glad that you called that out, because I feel like the first time that I heard about this a month and a half ago is it was coming to premium and I did not notice when I pulled this. Yep.
Yep. That's why, that's kind of, like I said, why I wanted to highlight it is because that's a pretty big shift that they just made, making it accessible to everyone. And I think owes or lends itself to that approachability factor with Clipchamp.
All right, Chris. So that's the last message that I had. Let me pull us back here. Anything else specifically coming up in the near term that you wanted to talk about in terms of Message Center? Maybe talk a little bit about our new Copilot product that we're rolling out.
Yeah, just sort of as we've seen with even some of today's, how much all of the Copilot and AI functionality is going to continue to pervade more and more into all of these platforms and services. And it's just how things are going to evolve. And it's going to be fascinating to see how and in what capacity the different AI functions start to manifest. But it does force everyone, I think, ourselves and all of the organizations of the world to have to start re-rationalizing their data estate and how they're going to manage, govern, and secure all of these different aspects of how AI interfaces throughout all these different services. So in our case, that's why we've tried to stay ahead of it to help make sure organizations are successful with how not just AI and the unique, or not, what am I trying to say? Like how, not just how AI is this separate element correlates, but just how it's going to manifest through all these things and having a readiness oriented around all of that from a technical, a training, a supportability perspective. And so in our case, we have developed what we call our Copilot Expeditionary Package that allows us to get inside, work with you and your organization heavily to really just ground everyone in what this stuff really is, how it works, what the essence of it is as it relates to all of these Microsoft 365 technologies, the security, the governance, the prerequisites, all these other pieces, and then help organizations get to a point of successfully moving towards a pilot, getting a lot of good feedback through that pilot process and doing surveys and other mechanisms to develop a really good approach to a production rollout, as well as developing a long-term sustainable way to embrace all of this stuff through things like centers of excellence and operationalization components. And so it's pretty comprehensive, but also designed to allow people to leverage us in different ways throughout. It's broken into logical sections so that if you're farther along or not quite this far along, you have some flexibility in how we can help. So eager
Great.
to put those that are interested.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And thanks again for coming on the show this week and filling in for Holly. Just I'll take us out here. If your organization is interested in learning more about Microsoft 365, or you're already using it today and you need help implementing new services or managing the existing services that you have, you can contact Vertiva by emailing us at letstalk@vertiva.com or by visiting our website at www.virteva.com. And if you made it this far, please don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons to help us out. Thanks a lot and have a great day. Bye.
Bye.